A widow became the oldest janitor at a small-town school, respected by everyone for her dedication. When asked to care for an ailing retired teacher, she agreed without hesitation despite her own exhaustion. After days of tending to his every need through physical pain, she discovered he was perfectly healthy. It was all a test to see if women could still sacrifice themselves like in the old days. What happened next transformed both their lives forever. A story of dignity regained, an unexpected connection that will touch your heart. Welcome back. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy the story. The first light of morning crept through the windows of Franklin Elementary as Isabel Morgan moved through the empty corridors with practiced efficiency. At 67, her body protested with each bend and stretch as she mopped the linoleum floors, but her movements remained as meticulous as they had been for the last 15 years. The school building was silent this early, save for the gentle swish of her mop and the occasional groan of the old pipes, a symphony she had grown accustomed to since becoming the head custodian after her husband Thomas passed away. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," called Principal Winters. "Unusually early." The younger woman's normally composed face looked strained as she approached, clutching her phone. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I have an emergency." Isabel straightened, ignoring the familiar twinge in her lower back. "What's wrong, Mrs. Winters?" "My sister in Cleveland has been hospitalized. It's serious. I need to leave immediately," she explained, her voice tight with worry. "The school board has approved my emergency leave, but there's another matter." She hesitated. "It's about Professor Nathan Landowski." Isabel knew the name. Everyone in Millfield did. Nathan Landowski had been a revered history professor at the local high school for over 3 decades before retiring 5 years ago. His lectures on American history had inspired generations of students, many of whom had gone on to prestigious universities. "His house is undergoing major repairs after that storm damage last month," Principal Winters continued. "He's been staying at the Millfield Inn, but they're fully booked for a convention starting tomorrow. The board members are all unavailable, and I know it's a lot to ask, but you want me to look after him," Isabel finished, understanding immediately. The ache in her joints seemed to intensify at the mere suggestion. "Just for a week until I return. He's quite frail now, needs help with meals, medication, those sorts of things. We've arranged for him to stay in the guest cottage behind the school." Principal Winters looked genuinely apologetic. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other option, Mrs. Morgan." Isabel thought of her small apartment, the quiet evenings with only Thomas's photographs for company, the stack of library books she was finally finding time to read. She thought of her swollen knuckles and the heating pad she relied on each night. Then she thought of Professor Landowski, alone, elderly, in need. "Of course I'll help," she said, her voice steady despite her reservations. "Thomas always said, I had hands of gold and a heart of iron." The familiar phrase brought a sad smile to her lips. Thomas had been gone for 12 years, but she still lived by his words. "Thank you," breathed Principal Winters, relief washing over her features. "The cottage is ready. Professor Landowski will arrive this afternoon. I can't express how grateful I am." As the principal hurried away to make her travel arrangements, Isabel returned to her mopping, her movements slightly slower than before. The weight of this new responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, but she squared them determinedly. She had always been the one people counted on, the dependable Mrs. Morgan. This would be no different. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Isabel had cleaned the guest cottage from top to bottom. She had dusted the shelves, changed the linens, and stocked the small refrigerator with basic groceries from her own pantry. Her back screamed in protest, but she ignored it as she fluffed the pillows one last time. The sound of tires on gravel announced Professor Landowski's arrival. Isabel stepped outside, smoothing her grey-streaked hair and straightening her practical cardigan. A school board member's car pulled up, and from the passenger seat emerged a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with deliberate slowness, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. "Professor Landowski," Isabel greeted him with a respectful nod. "I'm Isabel Morgan, the school custodian. I'll be looking after you this week while Principal Winters is away." The professor's pale blue eyes assessed her sharply. "Mrs. Morgan, yes. I believe we met at the retirement ceremony for Vice Principal Edwards several years ago. Isabel was surprised, he remembered. That's right, sir. The board member transferred Professor Landowski's luggage to the cottage, explained the situation briefly, and departed with promises to check in. Isabel found herself alone with the elderly professor, who lowered himself carefully into a chair by the window. I require tea at precisely 4 o'clock, he stated without preamble. Earl Grey steeped for exactly 3 minutes with 1 teaspoon of honey. No milk. My medications must be administered at strict intervals. I have a chart in my briefcase. I prefer my meals at traditional times. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. I have specific dietary requirements outlined in a folder. I trust this won't be too complicated. Isabel felt her heart sink at the demanding tone, but maintained her composure. I'll do my best, Professor. I certainly hope so, he replied, turning his gaze to the window. I was told you were reliable. That first evening set the pattern for what became the most exhausting week of Isabel's life. Professor Landowski's needs were relentless and specific. His tea had to be steeped just so, his blankets arranged in a particular manner, his food prepared according to exact specifications. He complained about drafts that Isabel couldn't feel and insisted that his chair be repositioned multiple times throughout the day to catch the optimal light for reading. Yet for all his demands, he barely acknowledged Isabel's presence beyond issuing instructions. She became invisible the moment his needs were met, a ghost drifting through the cottage, filling water glasses and adjusting thermostats. By the 4th day, Isabel's body was in open rebellion. Her arthritis flared in her hands until each movement sent shooting pains up her arms. Her back spasmed as she bent to retrieve the professor's slippers from under his bed. Yet still she persisted, arriving at the cottage each morning at 6 to prepare his breakfast, before beginning her regular duties at the school, returning during her lunch break to check on him, and spending her evenings cooking, cleaning, and attending to his needs until he retired for the night. Mrs. Morgan, this soup is entirely too salty, Professor Landowski complained that evening, pushing away the bowl of homemade chicken soup that had once been Thomas's favorite. And I believe I requested that my laundry be pressed, not simply folded. Isabel stood in the small kitchenette, her hands red and raw from cleaning, her feet throbbing in her worn shoes. For a moment, an uncharacteristic flash of resentment surged through her. She had spent her lunch break making that soup, rushing to the grocery store for fresh ingredients, chopping vegetables despite the pain in her hands. I apologize, Professor, she said quietly, collecting the barely touched bowl. I'll prepare something else. See that you do, he replied dismissively, returning to his book. Isabel turned away, blinking back sudden tears. She was tired, bone deep, soul-weary tired. She thought of her empty apartment, of the simple dinner she would have prepared for herself, of the hot bath she longed to sink into to ease her aching joints. Instead, she would be here for hours yet, cooking a replacement meal, pressing laundry, preparing medications. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. The following morning, Isabel arrived at the cottage at her usual early hour, carrying fresh bread from the bakery that had just opened. She had risen even earlier than normal to make the detour, hoping the special treat might please the difficult professor. As she approached the cottage, however, she stopped short. Through the kitchen window, she could see Professor Landowski moving around the room with surprising agility. He filled the kettle and placed it on the stove, then reached high into a cabinet for a mug, a movement that should have been impossible for someone who had needed Isabel to retrieve items from the same cabinet just yesterday because they were impossible to reach with my condition. Isabel stood frozen, the bread clutched in her trembling hands as she watched the supposedly frail professor prepare his own breakfast with ease. There was no sign of the tremors that had necessitated her cutting his food, no evidence of the weakness that had required her to carry his books from room to room, no hint of the frailty that had her running back and forth to adjust his pillows, countless times throughout the day. Disbelief gave way to confusion, then to a slow-burning anger that Isabel had not allowed herself to feel in years. She had sacrificed her time, pushed her body beyond its limits, neglected her own needs. For what? For a man who had been pretending all along. She considered confronting him immediately, but found herself backing away instead. She needed time to process this betrayal, to understand its dimensions. She returned to the school building, mechanically, going through her morning cleaning routine while her mind whirled. That afternoon she returned to the cottage as scheduled, saying nothing about what she had witnessed. Professor Landowski was back in his chair, moving with the exaggerated slowness she had come to expect, asking her to bring him a glass of water that sat just beyond his reach. "Of course, Professor," she said, her voice surprisingly steady as she handed him the glass. "Ah, Mrs. Morgan," he sighed, taking a small sip. "Finding good help these days is so difficult. People simply don't understand the value of service anymore. In my day, people knew their place and performed their duties without complaint." Isabel felt something shift inside her, a tectonic plate of her personality moving for the first time in decades. "And what exactly is my place, Professor Landowski?" she asked quietly. He looked up, seemingly surprised by the question. "To serve those who need assistance, of course. It's a noble calling, being useful to others." "Yes, it is," Isabel agreed. "When the need is genuine, a flicker of something, awareness perhaps, or caution, passed across his face before he resumed his practiced expression of frail dignity. "I don't believe I understand your meaning." "I saw you this morning," Isabel said simply, moving quite comfortably around the kitchen, reaching high shelves, preparing your own breakfast. The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Landowski stared at her, his expression unreadable, before something in his demeanor subtly changed. He sat straighter, his shoulders squaring, slightly. "Well," he said finally, his voice losing its quavering quality, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" Isabel asked, surprised by her own boldness. "What exactly is going on here, Professor?" Nathan Landowski removed his glasses and polished them methodically with his handkerchief, a gesture that now seemed performative rather than necessary. When he replaced them, his gaze was sharp and clear. "An experiment, Mrs. Morgan," he admitted, with startling frankness. "A social experiment, if you will. I wanted to see if women these days still possessed the capacity for selfless service that was once the backbone of our society. Principal Winters unwittingly provided the perfect opportunity." Isabel felt her legs weaken, and she sank into the chair opposite him. The casual cruelty of his words struck her like a physical blow. An experiment. Her pain, her exhaustion, her sacrifice, all for an experiment. "You've been pretending to need my help," she said flatly, "all this time." "Not entirely pretending," he corrected, as if they were discussing an academic thesis rather than her dignity. "I am elderly, after all, but certainly exaggerating my limitations for the purpose of observation." Isabel stared at him, this man who had been revered in their community for decades. She thought of the students who had admired him, the colleagues who had respected him. Had they known this side of him, this casual disregard for others' humanity? "And what have you observed, Professor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you, at least, represent a dying breed, Mrs. Morgan," he replied, and she was astonished to detect a note of approval in his voice. "Your generation understood duty, sacrifice, not like the entitled youth of today." The compliment, if that's what it was, felt like salt in an open wound. Isabel rose from her chair, suddenly finding it impossible to remain in his presence a moment longer. "I'll return tomorrow to prepare your breakfast," she said mechanically, gathering her things. "Excellent," he nodded, settling back into his chair. "And perhaps a different soup for dinner, something less aggressively seasoned." Isabel left without another word, walking slowly back to her apartment through the gathering dusk. Inside, she moved to the photograph of Thomas on her mantel, her ritual each evening upon returning home. His kind eyes looked back at her from behind the glass. "What would you say about this, Thomas?" she whispered, tracing his face with a finger. "What would you tell me to do?" But for the first time in years, she couldn't imagine what Thomas would say. The violation she felt went beyond anything they had experienced together. This wasn't just about physical labor or inconvenience. It was about being seen as less than human, a subject in an experiment rather than a person with feelings and limits. That night, Isabel barely slept. Her body ached as always, but now her heart ached too, with humiliation, with anger, with a profound sense of betrayal. By morning, something had hardened inside her. She arrived at the cottage at the usual time, prepared breakfast silently, and left medication that wasn't needed beside a glass of water. As days passed, their interactions took on a strained quality. Professor Landowski, perhaps sensing the shift in her demeanor, began making small gestures that might have been attempts at atonement. He cleared his own dishes one evening. He folded his newspaper instead of leaving it scattered across the floor. Once, he even asked about her arthritis, noticing her wince as she poured his tea. But Isabel couldn't bring herself to acknowledge these efforts, not out of bitterness or vengeance, but because she had retreated to a place inside herself where his actions could no longer reach her. She performed her duties with mechanical precision, no longer going above and beyond, merely fulfilling the letter of her commitment. The professor's facade of frailty gradually dropped away as he realized the game was over. He moved more naturally now, requiring less assistance, though he still requested her presence and her service. It was as if, having admitted the deception, he saw no reason to continue it, but also no reason to relinquish the benefits it had provided. What might happen next between them would challenge everything Isabel thought she knew about forgiveness. Dignity and the capacity for human connection, even after profound betrayal. The cottage's small clock ticked loudly in the silence as Isabel prepared vegetables for the evening meal. 4 days had passed since her discovery, and the atmosphere between them remained glacial. Professor Landowski sat at the kitchen table, no longer pretending to be unable to join her in the kitchen, watching as she chopped carrots with hands that protested each movement. "You're in pain," he observed, his tone more statement than question. Isabel didn't respond, focusing on the precise movements of her knife. "Arthritis, I presume," he continued. "I have it in my knees, not as severe as I pretended, but present. Nonetheless." The carrot snapped under Isabel's knife with more force than necessary. "Is that supposed to make what you did acceptable?" Her direct question seemed to surprise him. For all their strained coexistence of the past days, they had not spoken openly about his deception since that first confrontation. "No," he said after a moment, the single syllable hanging in the air between them. "No, I don't suppose it does." Isabel added the carrots to the pot, keeping her back to him. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why me? Why go to such lengths for your experiment?" The professor was silent for so long that Isabel thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had lost its customary confidence. "Academic arrogance, perhaps," he admitted. "I've spent my life studying human behavior, teaching about social structures and cultural expectations. I've written papers on the changing nature of service and community obligation, but theory is bloodless without practical observation." "So I was your laboratory rat," Isabel said flatly. "My subject," he corrected, then winced at his own words. "That sounds no better, does it?" "It sounds exactly like what it was," Isabel replied, turning to face him at last. "Dehumanizing." The word landed between them with the weight of truth. Professor Landowski's eyes widened slightly, as if he was hearing something for the first time that should have been obvious all along. "I didn't see it that way," he said slowly. "I saw it as an honor in a strange way, testing whether the virtues I've spent my career extolling still existed." "There is no honor in deception," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "There is no virtue in causing unnecessary suffering. What you call self-sacrifice, Professor Landowski, I call basic human kindness. And you exploited it." She turned back to her cooking, the conversation seemingly over. But after a long moment she heard his chair scrape back. To her astonishment, Professor Landowski moved to the counter beside her and picked up a knife. "Show me how to help," he said quietly. Isabel stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or further manipulation. Finding none, she wordlessly handed him an onion. "Dice it finely," she instructed, her voice neutral. His knife skills were surprisingly competent, his movements precise as he prepared the onion. They worked in silence, the professor occasionally glancing at her for guidance or approval. When the vegetables were prepared, he stepped back, waiting for further instruction. "The pot needs stirring," Isabel said, nodding toward the stove. He complied without comment, taking up the wooden spoon and carefully attending to the simmering. "Soup?" There was something almost boyish in his concentration, as if he were a student eager to prove his worth to a demanding teacher. As they worked together, Isabel felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Not because she had forgiven him, she was far from that, but because in this small act of role reversal, there was an acknowledgement of her humanity that his experiment had denied. What will happen when the professor truly begins to understand the depth of his betrayal? Will Isabel find a way to reclaim her dignity without losing her compassion? The answers await as their unlikely connection continues to evolve. The following morning brought an unexpected development. When Isabel arrived at the cottage, she found Professor Landowski already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming before him. More surprisingly, a second cup waited at the place opposite his. "I made tea," he said, the statement somewhere between an announcement and an apology. "Earl Grey. I'm not certain how you take it." Isabel hesitated in the doorway, caught off guard by this reversal. "With milk," she said finally. "No sugar." He nodded and pushed the milk jug toward the empty seat. After a moment's consideration, Isabel sat down, adding milk to the waiting cup. They sipped their tea in silence, the unfamiliar tableau creating an almost tangible awkwardness between them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Professor Landowski began, setting his cup down carefully. "About dehumanizing you." Isabel looked up, surprised by his directness. "I've spent my career studying the ways societies organize themselves, the hierarchies we create, the values we assign to different types of work and different types of people," he continued. "And yet, I failed to apply that critical lens to my own behavior." "It's easier to analyze others than ourselves," Isabel observed quietly. "Indeed." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his cup. "Do you know what I taught my students about empathy, Mrs. Morgan? That it's the foundation of ethical citizenship, that without it, knowledge becomes merely a tool for manipulation rather than understanding." "And yet," Isabel said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "And yet," he echoed, having the grace to look ashamed, "I compartmentalized. I separated you as a subject from you as a person. It's inexcusable, particularly for someone who should know better." Isabel studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. His usual air of superiority had diminished, replaced by something that, if not quite contrition, at least approached self-awareness. "What would you tell your students if they did what you did?" she asked. The question clearly caught him off guard. He blinked rapidly, considering. "I would tell them that they had betrayed their education. That knowledge without compassion is worse than ignorance. And what would you expect them to do to make amends?" At this he smiled faintly. "You're an excellent teacher yourself, Mrs. Morgan." "I've had practice," she replied. 15 years of watching children learn the difference between right and wrong." Professor Landowski nodded slowly. "What must be learned can also be taught. Would you teach an old professor what he has clearly forgotten?" There was a vulnerability in the question that Isabel hadn't expected. She considered him, this man who had caused her such pain, but who now seemed genuinely discomfited by the realization of what he had done. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain the wall of professional distance she had constructed. But another part recognized something important in this moment, a chance not just for his redemption, but for her own healing. "I start my regular duties at the school in 20 minutes, she said, rising from the table. "The floor in the main hallway needs waxing today. It's hard on the knees and back." He looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned. "You want me to help you with your custodial duties?" "I want you to understand what service actually means," Isabel replied. "Not as a theory, not as an experiment, as lived experience." Professor Landowski considered this, then nodded slowly. "What time shall I meet you?" 8 o'clock. Bring clothes you don't mind getting dirty." True to his word, the professor appeared in the main hallway at precisely 8 o'clock. dressed in slacks and a sweater that had seen better days. Isabel, already setting up her equipment, felt a flicker of surprise that he had actually shown up. "What would you like me to do?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves. Isabel handed him a pair of rubber gloves. "We'll start with the bathrooms." If she had expected complaint or resistance, she was disappointed. Professor Landowski accepted the gloves and followed her to the first bathroom on their list. Isabel demonstrated the proper way to clean the sinks and toilets, showing him how to get into the difficult corners, explaining the importance of disinfection in spaces used by hundreds of children daily. He watched attentively, then took the cleaning supplies and set to work. His technique was clumsy at first, but he approached the task with the same methodical focus he might have applied to academic research. Isabel supervised, correcting his approach when necessary, acknowledging good work when it was deserved. By mid-morning, they had progressed to the hallway floor. Isabel showed him how to strip the old wax, the proper way to apply the new coat, the techniques to avoid streaking. The work was physically demanding, requiring them to kneel on hard surfaces and apply considerable pressure. Within an hour, the professor was sweating, his face flushed with exertion. "How do you do this every day?" he asked during a water break, massaging his lower back. "I don't have a choice," Isabel replied simply. "The work needs doing, and it's my job to do it." He considered this, then nodded. "I'm beginning to understand that my experiment asked of you what I myself would find challenging for a single day, let alone a lifetime." "It's not the work that was the problem," Isabel clarified. "It's the dishonesty, the manipulation. Have you ever felt betrayed by someone you were trying to help, or know someone who has? Share your experience in the comments." As they returned to their task, Isabel noticed the curious glances from teachers and students passing through the halls. The sight of the esteemed Professor Landowski on his hands and knees, scrubbing alongside the school custodian, was certainly unusual. Some looked confused, others amused. Principal Winters, had she been present, would likely have been horrified. By lunchtime, the professor's initial enthusiasm had waned in the face of physical reality. His hands, unaccustomed to such labor, were red and raw despite the gloves. His knees creaked audibly when he stood, and his posture had lost some of its natural dignity. Yet he continued without complaint, following Isabel's instructions with unexpected humility. "We'll break for lunch," Isabel announced as the noon bell rang. "You can return to the cottage if you wish." "And what will you do?" he asked. "I have 30 minutes. I usually eat in the break room." Professor Landowski seemed to make a decision. "May I join you, if you don't mind the company?" Isabel hesitated, then nodded. They walked together to the small staff break room, which was mercifully empty at this hour. Isabel removed her modest lunch from her bag. A sandwich, an apple, a small container of yogurt. The professor had brought nothing, clearly not having anticipated the invitation. Without a word, Isabel divided her sandwich and pushed half across the table to him. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. They ate in companionable silence, the shared meal somehow more intimate than their previous interactions. "Your husband," the professor said suddenly. "Thomas, wasn't it? What did he do?" Isabel was surprised by the personal question. "He was a cobbler, had a small shop downtown until he passed." "Skilled labor," Professor Landowski nodded. "Important work." "He thought so," Isabel agreed. "He used to say that a good pair of shoes could change a person's day, maybe even their life. He took pride in doing things right." "As do you," the professor observed. "I've watched you these past hours. There's an artistry to the way you work, a precision most people would never notice or appreciate." Isabel felt an unexpected warmth at the observation. "Thomas used to say I had hands of gold." "And a heart of iron," the professor added, recalling her earlier mention. An apt description, though perhaps too unyielding for the reality. Isabel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Iron is strong but brittle," he explained, slipping unconsciously into his professorial tone. "It can break under pressure. What I've witnessed in you is more like steel. Flexible, adaptable, capable of absorbing blows without shattering." The compliment, delivered with academic precision rather than flattery, caught Isabel off guard. For a moment, the pain and humiliation of the past week receded, replaced by a quiet recognition of her own strength, not just physical endurance, but moral resilience. The afternoon brought new tasks: window cleaning, carpet shampooing, furniture polishing. The professor continued to work alongside Isabel, asking questions not just about technique, but about her experiences, her observations of school life, her insights into the community they shared, but experienced so differently. By the end of the day, both were exhausted, but there was a new ease between them. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect that had been entirely absent before. As they put away the cleaning supplies, Professor Landowski turned to Isabel with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. "I would like to continue tomorrow," he said, "if you'll permit it." Isabel studied him, trying to discern his motivation. "This isn't necessary for your research." "No," he agreed, "it's necessary for something else entirely." She understood then that this was not about data or social experiments anymore. It was about atonement, imperfect, perhaps even self-serving, but genuine nonetheless. 7:30, she said finally. "We start in the cafeteria." As they parted ways, Isabel to her apartment, the professor to the cottage, neither could have predicted how this unusual arrangement would evolve, or how it would begin to heal wounds neither had fully acknowledged in themselves. The days that followed established a new routine. Each morning, Professor Landowski would join Isabel in her custodial duties, working alongside her for most of the day before retiring to the cottage in the late afternoon. In the evenings, they would prepare dinner together, the professor gradually taking on more responsibility in the kitchen as his confidence grew. Word of their unusual partnership spread quickly through the small school community. Children whispered and giggled when they passed the famous professor wielding a mop. Teachers exchanged theories about what could possibly have prompted this strange development. Some speculated that it was community service for some unknown transgression. Others suggested it was research for a new book. No one guessed the truth. For Isabel, the experience was transformative in unexpected ways. Having spent years working invisibly, the sudden attention was disconcerting. Yet there was also validation in seeing her daily labor acknowledged, not just by the professor, but by others who now stopped to thank her when they might previously have walked past without seeing her at all. On Thursday afternoon, as they polished the trophy cases in the main hallway, Professor Landowski broke their comfortable silence with a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" he asked. "You had every right to refuse after what I did." Isabel continued her methodical polishing, considering her answer carefully. "At first, I wanted you to understand what you had put me through," she admitted. "I thought a taste of physical labor might teach you something about respect." "A justified response," he nodded. "And now?" She paused, cloth in hand. "Now I think we're both learning something about visibility, about seeing and being seen." The professor's eyebrows rose in interest. "Elaborate, please." "For years I've worked in spaces where I'm essentially invisible," Isabel explained. "People walk past without acknowledging me. They leave messes for me to clean without considering the person who will do the cleaning. It's as if the work happens by magic, or more accurately, as if the work doesn't matter enough to consider who does it. And I was guilty of the same blindness," he said quietly. "Yes," Isabel agreed without rancor, "but now you're experiencing it from the other side. The students who once would have hung on your every word now barely meet your eyes when you're holding a mop. Some of the teachers who used to quote your books now find reasons to walk the long way around, rather than greet you while you're emptying trash cans." Professor Landowski nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Social status is not merely theoretical after all." "It never was," Isabel said simply, "but understanding that truth in your mind is different from feeling it in your bones." "And what are you learning?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You said we're both learning something." Isabel resumed her polishing, choosing her words with care. "I'm learning that being seen doesn't always require being elevated. Sometimes it's enough to have one person truly acknowledge the value of what you do, even if the rest of the world remains blind." The professor absorbed this insight with the same attention he might have given to a groundbreaking academic theory. "You're a philosopher as well as a custodian, Mrs. Morgan." "I've had a lot of time to think while mopping floors," she replied with the ghost of a smile. By Friday, the day before Principal Winters was due to return, something remarkable had happened. The rigid boundaries that had defined their initial relationship had dissolved into something more fluid and equal. They worked together efficiently, anticipating each other's needs, sharing the burden of physical labor. In the cottage, they moved around the small kitchen with the comfort of old dance partners, preparing meals and cleaning up afterward with minimal need for conversation. That evening, as they sat on the cottage's small porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Professor Landowski broke the companionable silence. "I've been offered a position," he said, "at Millfield Community College, teaching 2 classes a week on social history." "Congratulations," Isabel said sincerely. "When do you start?" "That depends," he replied, turning to look at her directly, "on whether I accept." Isabel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "This week has been illuminating," he continued. "I've realized that much of what I've taught over the years has been theoretical rather than experiential. I've analyzed social structures without truly understanding the lived experiences within them. And now? Now I believe I have something different to offer my students, something more authentic." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "But I would value a collaborator, someone with practical wisdom to balance my academic knowledge." Isabel stared at him, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "Me? In a classroom?" "As a guest lecturer initially," he clarified, "speaking about labor, dignity, community care, subjects you understand better than any academic I know." The proposal was so unexpected that Isabel found herself speechless. She had never imagined herself in such a role, had never been invited to share her insights in a formal setting. "You don't have to answer now," Professor Landowski added, seeing her confusion. "It's just something to consider." As darkness fell around them, Isabel contemplated this strange new possibility. A week ago she had been merely a custodian, ignored and exploited by this very man. Now he was offering her a platform, a voice, a chance to be heard in ways she had never imagined possible. What would this unexpected opportunity mean for Isabel? How might this unusual partnership challenge both their perceptions of knowledge, dignity, and purpose? These questions hung in the air as Principal Winters' return approached, promising yet another shift in their evolving relationship. Principal. Winters returned on Saturday afternoon, arriving at the cottage with an air of exhausted relief. Her sister was recovering well, and she was clearly eager to resume her normal duties. Isabel and Professor Landowski greeted her together, standing side by side in the cottage's small living room. "Mrs. Morgan, Professor Landowski," she nodded to each of them. "I hope everything went smoothly in my absence." The professor and Isabel exchanged a glance laden with shared understanding. "Mrs. Morgan has been exemplary," Professor Landowski stated. "I've rarely experienced such dedicated care." Principal Winters smiled, missing the complex layers in his simple statement. "I knew we could count on her. Mrs. Morgan has always been the backbone of Franklin Elementary." "Indeed," the professor agreed, his tone thoughtful, "though I wonder if we've fully appreciated what that means until now." The principal looked slightly confused, but continued with her practiced efficiency. "Well, everything is arranged for your return home, Professor. The repairs to your house have been completed ahead of schedule, and a car will arrive tomorrow morning to take you there." "Excellent," he nodded, "though I find I'm not quite as eager to return to solitude as I might have been a week ago." Principal Winters looked between them, noticing something had changed but unable to identify exactly what. "Well, I'll leave you to your evening. Mrs. Morgan, thank you again for stepping in during this emergency. The school board will ensure you're compensated for the extra hours." After she departed, a strange silence fell over the cottage. The imminent end of their arrangement hung in the air, unacknowledged but keenly felt. "Would you join me for a final dinner?" Professor Landowski asked. "I thought perhaps we might walk to Millfield Diner. My treat, of course." Isabel hesitated. Their shared meals in the cottage had become comfortable, but venturing into public together was something else entirely. "People will talk," she said. "Finally." "Let them," he replied with surprising firmness. "I find I'm growing less concerned with appearances and more interested in substance." And so they walked together through the twilight streets of Millfield, an unlikely pair drawing curious glances from passers-by who recognized them both, the distinguished professor and the school custodian, moving with the easy familiarity of old friends. At the diner, the hostess did a double-take before leading them to a booth by the window. Isabel felt uncomfortably conspicuous as other diners glanced their way, but Professor Landowski seemed entirely at ease, studying the menu. With the same focused attention, he gave to everything. "I recommend the meatloaf," Isabel offered. "Thomas always said it was the closest to his mother's recipe in town." "Then meatloaf it shall be," he decided, closing the menu. As they waited for their food, the professor leaned forward slightly. "Have you considered my proposal about the guest lectures?" Isabel traced the pattern on the Formica tabletop with her finger. "I'm not sure I have anything worth saying in a classroom." "On the contrary," he countered, "you have insights my students desperately need to hear, about dignity in labor, about the invisible infrastructure that sustains our communities, about resilience in the face of hardship." "Those aren't academic subjects," Isabel protested. "Perhaps that's precisely why they should be taught," he replied. "Academia too often divorces theory from lived experience. Your perspective would provide a crucial counterbalance." Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As they ate, Isabel considered his words. The idea both terrified and intrigued her. To stand before a classroom, to have her words valued, to be seen in a context entirely separate from mops and buckets and cleaning solutions. It was almost unimaginable. "I would be there," Professor Landowski added, sensing her hesitation. "Not to overshadow you, but to provide support if needed. Think of it as a continuation of our partnership, but with the roles somewhat reversed. You would be the teacher, and I the assistant." Isabel couldn't help but smile at the role reversal. "It's hard to imagine you as anyone's assistant, Professor." "A week ago it would have been impossible," he admitted, "but I find myself changed by recent experiences." "As am I," Isabel acknowledged quietly. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, each contemplating the unexpected path that had brought them to this moment. When the check came, the professor insisted on paying, despite Isabel's protest. "Consider it a small token of appreciation," he said firmly, "for lessons more valuable than any I've taught in a classroom." As they walked back toward the school grounds in the gathering darkness, their pace was unhurried, neither seemingly eager for the evening to end. "What will you do tomorrow?" Isabel asked as they approached the cottage. "When you return home?" "Begin preparations for the fall semester, assuming I accept the position," he replied. "And you?" "Sunday is my only day off," she said. "I usually visit Thomas at the cemetery, then spend the afternoon reading." He nodded, processing this glimpse into her private life. "May I ask what you're reading currently?" "Steinbeck," she answered. "East of Eden. Thomas gave me a first edition for our 20th anniversary." "An excellent choice," he approved. Steinbeck understood something profound about the dignity of ordinary lives. They reached the cottage door and paused, the moment awkward in its finality. "Thank you, Mrs. Morgan," Professor Landowski said formally, extending his hand. "For everything." Isabel took his offered hand, noting how different it felt from a week ago, slightly roughened now from unaccustomed labor. "You're welcome, Professor." "Nathan," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you?" "Isabel, then," she agreed with a small smile. "Good night, Isabel," he said, releasing her hand. "I hope we meet again soon." "Good night, Nathan." As Isabel walked back to her apartment, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had set down a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. The week had begun with humiliation and ended with something approaching mutual respect. Whatever came next, whether she accepted his proposal or not, something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Sunday passed in Isabel's usual quiet routine: church in the morning, flowers for Thomas's grave, an afternoon with her book. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the professor's offer, weighing possibilities she had never before considered. Monday. Morning found her back at Franklin Elementary, mopping the hallway floors before the students arrived. The familiar routine felt different somehow, not because the work had changed, but because she had. When Principal Winters passed by with a distracted greeting, Isabel responded with a confidence that caused the younger woman to pause and truly look at her, perhaps for the first time. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Morgan?" she asked, concerned by this subtle shift. "Perfectly fine, Mrs. Winters," Isabel replied. "I was just thinking about different ways of serving our community." The principal nodded vaguely and continued on her way, unaware of the depth behind Isabel's simple statement. At lunchtime, Isabel checked her rarely used mailbox in the staff room and was surprised to find an envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. Inside was a note from Professor Landowski, Nathan, confirming his acceptance of the teaching position and renewing his invitation for her to join him as a guest lecturer. He had taken the liberty of proposing specific dates to the department chair, who was apparently enthusiastic about the collaboration. Isabel folded the note carefully and returned it to her pocket, her decision already forming. That evening she composed a response at her small kitchen table, accepting his invitation with one condition: that they develop the lectures together, ensuring that theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom were given equal weight. 2 months. Later, Isabel stood at the front of a community college classroom, hands clasped to hide their slight trembling as she faced 30 curious students. Beside her, Professor Landowski, Nathan, introduced her not as a custodian but as an expert on community care and the ethics of service. "Mrs. Morgan brings a perspective that cannot be found in textbooks," he explained to the class. "Her insights come from decades of hard-earned wisdom that academia too often overlooks. I consider it a privilege to share this podium with her." As Isabel began to speak, her initial nervousness gave way to the same quiet confidence with which she approached all challenges. She spoke about visibility and invisibility in communities, about the dignity inherent in all forms of labor, about the complex web of service that sustained towns like Millfield. The students listened with rapt attention, many taking notes, several raising hands to ask thoughtful questions. Afterward, as they gathered their materials, Nathan turned to her with undisguised admiration. "That was remarkable, Isabel. You've given them more to think about in 1 hour than I typically manage in a week of lectures." Isabel felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with pride. "It felt good," she admitted. "To be heard. This is just the beginning," he promised, "if you're willing." Over the following months, their collaboration deepened and expanded. What had begun as occasional guest lectures evolved into a regular co-teaching arrangement. Isabel continued her work at Franklin Elementary, but with reduced hours that accommodated her new role at the college. Principal Winters, initially skeptical, had been won over by the positive publicity the unusual partnership had generated for the school. The most profound change, however, was in Isabel herself. She stood straighter now, spoke with greater assurance, claimed space in a world that had long relegated her to its margins. The students at the college sought her advice not just on academic matters but on practical life challenges. Her perspective, shaped by hardship, resilience, and profound empathy, offered what Nathan's theoretical knowledge could not. For his part, Nathan had undergone his own transformation. The academic arrogance that had led him to view Isabel as a research subject had given way to genuine humility. He referred to her as his colleague with evident pride, deferring to her expertise in their shared classroom, learning from her as much as she learned from him. Their friendship, for that was what it had undeniably become, puzzled many in Millfield. The distinguished professor and the school custodian made an odd pair as they shared lunch at the diner or discussed books on a park bench. Yet there was something in their unlikely connection that inspired others. Teachers at Franklin Elementary began acknowledging the custodial staff with new appreciation. Students at the college initiated a visibility project to recognize essential workers throughout the community. 1 year after their tumultuous beginning, Isabel and Nathan stood together on the stage of Millfield Community College's small auditorium, accepting an award for community education. As Nathan stepped aside to let Isabel speak, he reflected on how completely his experiment had transformed them both, teaching him lessons about dignity, service, and human connection that no academic study could have provided. Isabel, looking out at the audience that included both college students and staff from Franklin Elementary, felt Thomas's words echo in her mind, hands of gold and a heart of iron. She had always believed those qualities defined her capacity for service. Now she understood they also defined her capacity for growth, for asserting her own worth, for transforming humiliation into triumph. True education, she told the audience, her voice steady and clear, happens when we recognize the teacher in each person we meet. When we understand that wisdom comes not from status or credentials, but from lived experience and an open heart. When we are willing to learn from unexpected sources and to teach from our deepest truths. As applause filled the auditorium, Isabel caught Nathan's eye. In his gaze was something beyond respect or admiration, a recognition of the profound journey they had traveled together, from deception to truth, from exploitation to partnership, from invisibility to being truly seen. Outside the auditorium, spring had come to Millfield. The trees on campus were heavy with blossoms, promising new beginnings. For Isabel Morgan, once defined solely by her role as a school custodian, life had blossomed in similarly unexpected ways, proving that transformation was possible at any age and that dignity, once claimed, could never truly be taken away. What will the next chapter hold for this unlikely pair? Perhaps only time will tell, but one thing is certain: neither would ever again underestimate the power of being truly seen or the healing potential of genuine human connection. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.